Hi everybody, this is Muchaneta here from Fashion Nerd. I'm here at the Keyhouse today with Michael Stanley Jones. Michael, tell me a little bit about what you do and your title.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I serve as the co-secretary of the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. That's a new UN interagency body working to promote fashion for the 2030 agenda. My title is Program Management Officer. How boring is that? But I also serve as Communications Officer for, now a long name, Global Program of Action for Protection of the Marine Environment from Land-Based Sources of Pollution. Well, better known in part as the Clean Seas Campaign, the part of the UN that addresses plastic pollution in our oceans and waterways.
So tell us about the 2030 change, did you say, or initiative? Agenda. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, I know we were on a panel together and you spoke a little bit about it. I mean, could you tell the audience what it is exactly?
That's the playbook of the United Nations, agreed by all member states in 2015 to set a 15-year agenda to achieve 17 sustainable development goals, 169 targets. It's a lot of things to keep track of. But fashion, interestingly, cuts across many of those goals. Goals about gender equality, goals about equity, goals about sustainable consumption and production, and addressing the climate crisis.
And do you honestly think that the fashion industry is going to reach that goal by 2030? Because there's a lot of talk, but it doesn't seem not too much action. So what are your thoughts on that?
Slightly disagree. I think there's a lot of action, but the question is it sufficient? Is it enough to get us to 2030, or more importantly, to the target set through the Paris Agreement on achieving carbon neutral economy by 2050? Oh, what's that all about? Currently, fashion produces 8.1% of the global load of greenhouse gas emissions annually. And that's far too large a load. But worse than that, fashion's carbon emissions have been growing at a very rapid and uncontrollable rate. So it's estimated that in 2030, that load will increase by 60%. Well, how is that when everyone in the world has agreed that we need to cut our carbon load so we can keep the global temperature increase on average below 1.5 or at worst 2 degrees Celsius increase? We've already experienced nearly a Celsius degree increase on average globally. That may not sound like a lot because temperatures fluctuate on a daily basis, but on average that's catastrophic, leading to harmful effects on the ecosystems and on people's lives. Fashion needs to cut its carbon footprint. And to do that, the fashion industry, fashion brands need to offer a pathway to carbon neutrality, how they can make clothes without emitting more greenhouse gases than they bury in the process.
So if you're saying that there's probably a lot more action at the moment, a little bit more action than we would expect, is there any innovation that you are quite impressed with, a change that you're like, this is actually quite good and we should all adopt this?
Big question on what we should all adopt, but each of us need to take steps that'll move us closer to that 2030 and 2050 target. And some of the innovations that we've seen are the digitalization of fashion. What does that mean? It means that we are using our internet communication tools to understand where fashion comes from, what it consists of, what kind of processes, and what kind of consequences those processes have on the environment, like carbon footprint, like water pollution, water consumption. Now, to get to that neutrality, we also can address those other issues to make fashion ethically, to make it more sustainably, and to use less natural resources. It turns out if you get one of those things right, you probably are getting some other ones right. The technology is available. I mentioned digitalization. That gives us the chance to make fashion upon demand. So we only make the clothes we actually plan to wear. It's not bespoke. It's not the old fashion tailoring economy. It's a new one where customers say what they want when they want it, and then it's produced according to their demand. No middleman, as they say, no warehousing, no building up a lot of stock that later has to be destroyed, incinerated, because otherwise it'll rot in a warehouse, and no transporting it, shuffling it from warehouse to department store, to other points of distribution that aren't needed if we only knew where the end consumer wanted that product. That's one technology, but there are other things that are simpler, like choosing better fibers. Some plants are more sustainable than others. Everybody loves cotton, but cotton is actually very hard on the soil, and it causes salination, a building up of salt, which makes the land unproductive after the monocultural raising of cotton is concluded. Well, everyone loves cotton, so what can we do to make cotton more sustainable? How can we make it more water efficient? Or should we substitute other crops like hemp or cassava or even...
You mentioned bananas.
I did see some fashion made from bananas. I was going to say water hyacinth, but the word water lily flew into my head. Well, water lily sounds nice, but it's actually, hyacinth is a water pollutant in many African lakes. And it grows rapidly when those lakes when there are pollutants in the water. Eutrophication happens when there's too much nutrients added to the water. So, for example, at Lake Victoria in Kenya, there's vast flower plantations raising and exporting flowers to the European market. Sounds great, but it leaves behind pollutants that cause the water hyacinths to bloom, choking off other species that live in those environments. So that's a pollution issue, and it's related to the way we consume, in this case, chemicals used to help raise flowers. But water hyacinth turns out to be something you can make fashion from. Who would have guessed that? But we had a beautiful demonstration of that in Nairobi at the Sustainable Innovations Forum. You can take other crops like sesal, which is used largely in basket making, but could be used, if processed well, for making fiber for clothing. Sesal grows rapidly, it's gentle on the landscape, and it's a resource that East Africans would have easy access to. So these kinds of products could help reignite local markets for textiles, employing some local traditional technologies like natural dyeing techniques, and the natural design and the artistry of Africa. That's my background, that's my home, but those lessons can be adopted in other parts of the world. In China, for example, there's a return to some handicraft and to adding value by adding beauty to the fashion rather than fast fashion, the Mac fashion that we've grown up with in the last 15, 20 years. We need to move away from those unsustainable models and get back to craft, get back to home distribution, home creation, home artistry. That'll help bring jobs and sustainability back into the sector.
I was actually, so you told me that you live in Nairobi. I was actually going to ask you, you don't hear much about innovation coming out of the continent of Africa. I mean, you're sounding like there's a lot going on over there that no one's really talking about, writing about, maybe even appreciating. What else would you say we should keep our eye on in terms of what's going on in Nairobi?
I've been in Nairobi now for 5 years, and I grew up in Silicon Valley in the shadow of what's now Appleville, Cupertino, California. And I worked with the Silicon Valley Environmental Partnership with innovators in Silicon Valley on applying technologies for protecting the environment and protecting people's livelihoods. I'm fascinated by what's happening in East Africa, the part of Africa I know best. Kenyans are very adept at using information technology, using mobile telephony, mobile phones, to do financial transactions. They're very good at communicating using mobile technology. And those skills can be applied to building new business models for fashion. I'm a fan of the film Black Panther, but that's because I've actually seen some of those innovations on the ground in Nairobi. They were far in advance of using internet for financial transactions than I was, having been raised in California.
That's interesting. On our panel today, we talked about how everything is going to be close to home manufacturing-wise, and people are going to probably not go to Bangladesh or go to China and whatnot. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Does that mean that the jobs will no longer exist in Bangladesh if everyone kind of like produces and manufactures in their own hometown? I mean, do you see any sort of danger in that?
I don't think these are exclusive. The digitalization gives you the ability to take an order in one place, to do the manufacturing in another place, and maybe pick the materials that you want for that design from yet a third place. It links us up in ways the market hadn't done before. The old model was one company made those choices. There was a buyer. The new model is we are the buyers. We are the drivers of our patterns of consumption. So we could go online, for example. We could pick the sustainable materials, understanding with the information in the backdrop what their impacts are. So perhaps this material is a little bit more expensive than another choice, but we can see that that fiber will last X years longer, and it might be a better investment for sustainability. We can also see the communities that are making the products that we wear. We can see whether they're paying fair wages. We can see whether they have a human rights record that we could respect. You know, these things consumers care about, but currently they don't have the access to information they need to make these ethical, conscious choices. Those choices virtually will also be choices for sustainability. They'll lower our impact. They'll raise incomes for communities that have so far been left behind or been excluded from the global market. The value chain is a two-sided sword. It can concentrate power and resources in the hands of a few. That's what we currently see. Or it can distribute them more broadly in the hands of the many. And that's where we need to be. An inclusive green economic transformation has to happen in fashion.
And last of all, this is your first time to the Keyhouse. What are your thoughts? I mean, we're trying here to introduce innovation to the textiles industry, get people excited about what's going on with technology and how they can improve their business. So what are your thoughts of the Keyhouse?
Well, I'm excited to be here. I had never been to Keyhouse, but I had never actually been to a textile fair, trade fair, you could call it, or an innovation and textile fair, or a fashion fair of any kind whatsoever. I mean, I am your stand-up bureaucrat from the United Nations who didn't know this world of innovation that's happening in the fashion sector until quite recently. And I'm very excited to see it. Someone said we need to marry Silicon Valley with Hudson Valley. Okay, I'm from Silicon Valley. Hudson Valley is a bit more obscure, but it's where some of America's great painters live. And it's where small handcrafted art and crafts are produced. So what their message behind that is that we can take a very traditional industry like textiles, like clothing, and we can transform it using innovation into the 21st century and the model of a sustainable economy. That's what's so exciting, to take what had been, frankly, a laggard, but is turning into a leader.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming to talk to us, Michael, and we hope that you continue to enjoy the Keyhouse. Thank you.